Mhm.
Good evening and a warm welcome for tonight's event. I'm Jenny Murray, Extension Master Gardener with Master Gardeners of Greater Kansas City. We're happy you're here and we hope you enjoy tonight's presentation. To make tonight's event enjoyable for everyone, we're beginning with some housekeeping suggestions, and I'll also be providing information about our speaker as well as the University of Missouri Master Gardener program. First, tonight's presentation, as you just heard, is being recorded. In 1 to 2 days, the entire recording will be available for you to watch on a University of Missouri YouTube channel. If you know people who may be interested in watching, but who aren't here with us this evening, you can let them know the recording will be made available to the public soon. We'll drop the address for where you can find the recording in the chat box. Second, tonight's presentation is set up as a webinar. This means that all microphones and cameras are turned off for all attendees except the designated hosts and speaker. Hopefully this will help with streaming the event. Third, I mentioned that your hosts are dropping information in the chat and has been mentioned in the past few minutes. As you settle in, we'd love to know where you're from, what city, state, area. We'd also be curious to know if you're an Extension Master Gardener. We did max out our registration capacity a few weeks ago, and we know that some folks, as a result of that, are having watch parties with multiple people together. So if you're having a watch party, please say so in the chat box and let us know how many people are attending. Fourth, we have a question and answer opportunity. Drop your questions in writing in the Q&A icon. I see that Q&A icon at the top of my screen. Please do not post questions in the chat. With this many registrants and attendees, there's a good chance that any question you put in the chat box will be lost. So again, please put your questions for Craig in the Q&A icon. Hosts will be monitoring and keeping track of questions in the Q&A. About halfway through the presentation, we'll take a break to read those questions aloud and get the answers. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll have another Q&A session. Craig has graciously agreed to stick around at the end and answer questions. So this is your opportunity to talk tomatoes and ask all things tomato related. Fifth, to enable captions, click the captioning option on your Zoom screen. For me, this is at the bottom of the screen. Finally, with this many attendees, there may be technical glitches that are unavoidable during any live event. If you run into a technical issue, such as audio dropping or your screen freezing, the best course of action is to refresh your page. It may solve the problem. Another option is to leave the webinar and log back on. A quick reset either way may solve the technical problem you're having. One of the University of Missouri's key programs is the Extension Master Gardener program. Extension Master Gardeners are trained volunteers who provide educational outreach on a wide variety of horticultural topics, everything from soil health to pollinator-friendly practices. Tonight's event is brought to you by the Extension Master Gardeners of Greater Kansas City. We are the largest Master Gardener chapter in the state of Missouri, covering multiple counties in the Greater Kansas City metro region. Throughout the evening, we will post links in the chat about our chapter, the Master Gardener training program, as well as upcoming events for our chapter. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Craig LeHoullier. Craig is a scientist by education and trade, as well as being a nearly lifelong passionate home gardener. Some of you may know him as the North Carolina Tomatoman. He's appeared on television programs such as Growing a Greener World. He's the author of 2 books, Epic Tomatoes and Growing Vegetables in Straw Bales, and he's a frequent guest on numerous podcasts and radio shows about gardening. Craig also maintains a website where you can follow his blog and learn about his upcoming events and appearances. Craig also has an Instagram account where he hosts Instagram Live get-togethers each week from roughly March up to November. Craig has been involved in tomato breeding, and he's an advocate of community-based or citizen science. He's personally stabilized many tomato seed varieties and been involved in releasing them to the public, collaborating with Seed Savers Exchange and Victory Seed, to name but two organizations for which he's worked as an advisor for tomatoes. Craig is responsible for naming and popularizing what is surely one of the most favorite heirloom or open pollinated tomato varieties in the United States, the beloved Cherokee Purple. Craig's love of tomato breeding led him and others to establish the Dwarf Tomato Project in 2005, and that project has led to the creation of more than 145 varieties of full-size slicing tomatoes on dwarf plants. Craig is also working on a new book about the Dwarf Tomato Project, so keep an eye out for his new book in the future. We'll put links and information about Craig's books and his many TV, radio, and podcast appearances in the chat. We'll also put information about his website and Instagram account in the chat so that you can follow him on social media. I'm going to turn my mic off now and turn it over to Craig LeHoullier. Craig, welcome.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And you have all been so wonderful, just such warm, friendly hosts. And I'm so appreciative of the opportunity to provide this information. And this is kind of a special one because it's my first tomato event of the year. Now, I know all of you garden, I'm sure. And so this thing called a calendar doesn't always really fit with gardeners. There's really no beginning or end. There's just different activities. But I always like to think, right at New Year, okay, my 2024 events are done, and let's see what 2025 brings. So buckle up. There's going to be a lot of information. We're going to move at a crisp pace. And just remember, ask your questions, and anything that doesn't get answered here, you always have an opportunity to drop me an email, and you'll see that email address toward the end. I really put an effort to getting back to everyone who has questions. So I always like to start off with just a few news items. If this was gardening season, I would show a picture of the garden as it is today. However, as you'll see in the next picture, there's snow out there. But the biggest surprise of my wife Susan's and I life perhaps was when our daughter Caitlin gave birth on December 27th to this little fella, Eli, and she and her boyfriend Jason are starting to use us as babysitters, an activity that we really get excited about. So he's still really young, but he's really a bundle, 9 pounds, 3 ounces. This is why there's really no garden to look at. This is our paltry little 2 inches of snow that we got on December 10th. And check out the date today, and most of that snow is still on the ground because it's just been so cold. Anyway, here we go. So here we are, and I've already seen a mistake on this slide. We are now in 2025, but the truth of this slide still holds. We are so lucky. We probably were the most fortunate tomato growers in the history of horticulture in this country. And the next few slides, I'll demonstrate why. So we moved from Pennsylvania, where I did a lot of my early gardening, to Raleigh, North Carolina in 1992. And I was thinking, Raleigh, North Carolina, rural. I bet you when we go to farmers markets, we're going to see a lot of diversity in all kinds of produce. But no, and this is a typical picture in the early 90s of what farmers markets look like. Red tomatoes, for various reasons that we'll get into. But I want to take you back much further than 1990s, early 1990s to 1840. And let's pretend that you're a pioneer and you put on your boots and go to your mailbox because you want to find your direct seed catalog that you sent away for. And you start flipping through it. Well, if you wanted to grow a big tomato garden, you would be really out of luck because here's the T page, part of it. Above the word tomato were maybe 40 different squash. Turnip, a crop that doesn't get a whole lot of attention and respect today, there were at least 20 types. What there was tomato, just one, no description. So how do we think, how do we find what this tomato may have looked like? Well, we go back to seed catalog. We go back to art in Europe because the tomato made its way from Central and South America over to Europe in the late 1500s, and then it made its way through Europe, and it came over to North America sometime in the early to mid 1800s. We'll talk about that in a moment. But if you look at still life painting from European countries in the 1700s, you get a sense of what tomato may have looked like. Now, here's a little interesting tidbit that I'll share with you, and I call this the Monticello mystery tomato. I'll tell the story in a second, but this could be what tomato looked like. Very regular, very creased. Anybody who's grown tomatoes like Zapotec and Yellow Accordion or Castelluto Genovese have seen this type of creasing. So I was giving a talk at Monticello for their Harvest Festival in, I think, 2013, and they wanted me to come early to bring me to show me something. They were excavating parts of their kitchen garden area. And what they do when they excavate is they take layers of dirt that they can date and they bring some into the greenhouse just on the chance something will germinate. They got a tomato plant to germinate from the probably 1780 to 1820 range, and it was full of fruit when I looked at it. And they said, "What could this be?" And I said, "Well, we're going to need to do some DNA testing using things that look like this that we can compare it to. If a tomato seed would have survived in the ground from that time, it would have been very, very, very rare. But a possible combination of being in the clay, having no air attacking it, who knows? But anyway, I can't really distribute this, but I'm working with Monticello to see if we can pin this down a little bit. But that's what tomato probably looked like in that 1840 Breck catalog. Now, I returned to that farmer's market just before we moved out in 2019, when we moved from Raleigh to Hendersonville, a few hundred miles west. Boy, have we come a long way since 1840. We now can go to farmers markets and find yellows and whites and stripes and greens and hearts and big ones and small ones. This is why I say we're the most fortunate tomato growers ever. However, with that good fortune comes the conundrum that I'll talk about in a moment. But I do want to recognize the Seed Savers Exchange because this is an extremely important year for them. They formed in 1975 when one of the founders, Kent Wheely, with his wife Diane, was becoming extremely concerned of the loss of our genetic material through the move of gardeners to grow hybrids, which you can't really save seed and pass them along, to elderly people just not passing on their seeds when they pass away, and they just end up eaten in their root cellars. So Kent and the Seed Savers Exchange and Diane were really primarily important in allowing us to have this huge selection of tomatoes to choose from. I call their annual yearbook the Bible of Diversity, and I have all 50 of their yearbooks. So I can actually do all kinds of research on not only tomatoes, beans, apple, lettuce, you name it. It's a really wonderful, worthwhile organization to join and become involved with. However, so many catalogs. That Seed Savers Exchange yearbook probably contains over 10,000 varieties of named tomatoes. Not that they're all different. Some of them probably have synonyms and such, but you can choose amongst 10,000 different ones. How do we choose our tomato varieties? So the first half of this talk, before we get into some questions, will be a journey through tomatoes, looking at the different parameters that can help you decide what you want to grow in your garden, what you want to grow in your particular location, knowing your conditions. What do you like to eat? One thing I wanted to get straight right from the start is a lot of people that I know, really good gardeners, will, for example, I'm in Hendersonville, North Carolina. They strive to purchase their seeds from a company in Hendersonville. When Mike Dunton ran Victory Seeds out in Oregon, he would have a lot of customers that bought from them because they were local, and that's great. The truth of the matter is almost all seed companies purchase some or all of their material, depending on whether they have breeding programs, from all kinds of different companies all over the world. And so you don't really have to focus local. What you do is you find a variety you like and you research it from a few resources and you can just run with it. You can go to the Garden Watchdog website to find ratings of different seed companies, to see if they tend to sell varieties that come true from seed, or there's some germination issues or some mix-ups. This little bit about adaptation, and this is where really it's not terribly important to always buy from a local company. Adaptation, rather than something changing genetically when being grown in your area, is more about you are the geneticist. And let's say you grow 10 Cherokee purples and one of them does a little bit better. There's still some lingering instability. So if you saved seeds just from that slightly better Cherokee purple, you're on your way to actually creating a different variety. The package of genes could be so different. And so that's what a lot of people think of as adaptation, is doing selections to get something a little bit different that may grow a little bit better in your area. Let's get some of these terms straight because it's really important. And I'm sure a lot of you know this, but hybrid, sun gold, many people's favorite tomato. It's definitely in my top 3. So a hybrid is created when somebody in a greenhouse somewhere has 2 parents that would combine to create something that's better than the sum of its parts. And those 2 parents are kept secret. Every hybrid seed comes from a handmade cross. So somebody is taking pollen from dad, applying to the flowers of mom, and then if a tomato forms, it's the seeds in those tomatoes that wind up in the packet. That's why they're more expensive. If you save seed from sun gold, you won't get sun gold. The F2 generation will provide a great deal of diversity, and some may or may not look like the hybrid. This is what worries me sometimes about seed libraries. If people will pick up a hybrid, grow it out, save seed, and then put it back in to be distributed, it's really not going to be that same variety. Heirloom, but hybrids have their place. Uh, they can have more vigor. They can have more disease resistance, or you can just find a hybrid that has particularly good flavor or gives a high yield for you. Heirlooms are varieties that have a history. So an heirloom watch, an heirloom grandfather clock, they have stories behind them. I like to use a cutoff date of prior to 1950 or so, because 1949 is when Burpee created and released Big Boy, the first hybrid tomato that became wildly popular and started many companies on the way to creating hybrids instead of selling non-hybrids. So what's special about an heirloom is you can tell the story with it and you can save seeds and share them. Open pollinated is a synonym for heirloom, but there are recent open pollinated varieties. Open pollinated is the opposite of hybrid. It's been stabilized. It's been grown out to enough generations so that it will breed true, but I like to reserve the term heirloom for those open pollinated varieties that predate 1950 or so, and they have true stories associated with it. So Jenny mentioned Cherokee Purple, and this really was serendipity at its finest. That I was sitting there in my house looking through seed catalogs when we lived in Westchester, Pennsylvania back in 1990, and this letter came in the mail from a man who lived in Sevierville, Tennessee, named J.D. Green. He included some seeds, and he writes that this is a variety that he received from someone who received them from the Cherokee Indians, and they were over 100 years old. And he described it as being purple. So here's me and JD, perhaps as the only two people who have this variety any longer. So I grew it and loved it. This predated the black tomato phenomenon that everybody's so crazy about. So this is the first time I'd ever seen this color growing anywhere, and it was delicious. So I sent seeds to Jeff McCormick of Southern Exposure Seed Exchange. I named it Cherokee Purple, and he called me back and he said, "So fine tasting tomato, great story, but it's ugly. It looks like a bruised leg. It's never going to catch on. People will not want to grow and eat a tomato that looks that color." Well, Jeff, he's still a good friend, and he knows he's been proven wrong, because oddly enough, this tomato has just captured the hearts of a lot of gardeners. A little more to the story is it turns out that the grandfather of Gene Greenlee of Rutledge, Tennessee, received the seeds from Cherokee Nation, and it was Gene who shared them with JD, who then shared them to me. So if you grow an heirloom variety in your garden, you could have a story to share, and stories are the way that we create gardeners. They entice people to try something new. So the Dwarf Breeding Project, this is fun, and I've got some updated information here. Um, it actually officially ended in 2023 because we started it in 2005 and we've accomplished a lot. However, it's still ticking slowly along. And one of the things I look forward to is seeing if anybody in the Master Gardener organization in Kansas City or elsewhere wants to dip their toe into the water and help us play with creating new ones. We've had 1,000 volunteers or more from 50 states and 25 countries. We now have, as of the latest count in the Victory Seed Catalog, because they are the ones that are pledged to release all of our varieties, 167 varieties, and there will be more in the future. And all of our dwarf tomatoes are pledged to the Open Source Seed Initiative, OSSI, which means they can be purchased, they can be grown, seeds can be saved from them, they're stable, they can be used for breeding other varieties. What they can't have done is to be patented and to prevent people from using them in ways that they wish. So I want to just talk briefly, and when Ginny asked me to do this talk, she actually said a little bit about an interest in just hearing a bit about breeding. It's so much fun and it's so easy. And you can use an electric toothbrush or this device on the left, which is called a veggie bee that I purchased on Amazon, which is just a vibrating wand. A black shiny plastic spoon comes with it. That way you can see the pollen. And the tweezers help you dissect a flower. Here's how it works. You think about what you would like to cross. You think about what your male would want to be and your female would want to be, and this is a whole other talk. That's way out of scope for this talk. But if you vibrate, I go up to the flower of the male, and on a warm, not humid day, you just touch that veggie bee to the back of the flower, the open flower, and you'll see those little granules in the spoon, and those are countless numbers of pollen granule. And then you go to the female plant and you gently tug off the anther cone, leaving the pistil. And the whole process, and you want to remove that before the flower self-pollinates, because tomatoes are perfect flowered. You have the male and the female on the flower, so as the flower opens, the anthers brush against the pistil and the pollination is done. So you got to get to this before pollination happens. So I try to look for flowers that are pale yellow and are not fully open. And then this, I'm sorry, this picture is a little blurry, but I just dip the pistil of the female into the spoon, into the pollen, and just rub it around a few times gently, and then repeat this for 3 days. And if a tomato forms, I put an X on it and I mark it with a twisty tie, because that means this is very likely a hybrid between the male, the pollen, and the flower, the female. And I will save seeds from that and grow it out as a hybrid. That begins the process. Then you distribute those and go through the selections of F3, F4, F5 generations. It's so much fun. And I've done it with indeterminate times indeterminate types that I'll tell you about. What makes dwarf plants interesting? They have a totally unique growth habit. I think of them as an indeterminate, a tall type that grows vertically at only half of the rate. So if your Cherokee Purple is 8 feet at the end of your season, the dwarf variety will be about 4 feet tall, but they fruit like indeterminates. They fruit gradually. They're not like determinants like Roma or Taxi that put all their fruit out over a 2-week period and then you toss the plant. These will go on until frost. And so you can grow them in containers like 5-gallon grow bags and get perfectly fine yields out of them. You can grow them in the ground too, of course. And I just wanted to show you a few of those that I really like, and they exhibit some of the really pretty color variations. So Dwarf Sweet Sue, which is up in the left corner, I named after my wife Susan, and fortunately it's one of my favorite tomatoes. It's for people that like very full flavored tomatoes that have a lot of sweetness as well. Dwarf Speckled Heart in the upper right is a beautiful 8-ounce heart-shaped striped tomato that's very meaty, but yet very delicious. In the lower left is Fred's tie-dye that looks as if you took a Cherokee purple and painted greenish and golden stripes on it. And in the lower right is a color that we discovered, the black orange. It's an orange tomato that has the overtones of a Cherokee purple with it. And Patrina in Australia, my project co-lead, found that and called it Uluru Ochre. The Victory Seed Company, and you can just go to victory.com and they have pull down menus where you can search just for dwarf tomatoes, and you can actually filter this for alphabetical or whatever. But they list all 167. Some of them are out of stock, and we did not promote this project. What we said is if we build it, people will come, the typical Field of Dreams story. And so if I Google Dwarf Sweet Sue, I'll find that 50 seed companies are now carrying it. They all went to Victory to get their seed initially or asked me, and they're selling it now. And I know friends who run seed companies in Greece and in Spain and in England that are selling these dwarfs. So they are getting out there. What I don't think is happening yet is they're showing up in great amounts seedlings at farmers markets or gardening centers yet, but I think that will follow. And I don't only play with dwarfs now, but I wanted to ask myself the question, if I take two of my favorite heirloom types and create a hybrid, will the hybrid taste even better than the heirlooms? And I did this with 12 different pairs, but this is the one I want to talk about. I took Cherokee Purple, one of my top 3 tomatoes of all time to eat on the left, and the Lillian's Yellow Heirloom, another one of my top 3 tomatoes of all time. So you've got my 3, Sun Gold, Lillian's Yellow, Cherokee Purple. And I did the pollen of Cherokee Purple onto Lillian's Yellow. Lillian's Yellow is potato leaf. If the cross takes, the seedling of the hybrid becomes the dominant leaf, which is regular. My regular leaf hybrid plant gave me these really huge pink tomatoes, the flavor of which is one of the greatest tomatoes I've ever eaten in my life. Now, when you save seeds from that center tomato, you get all kinds of interesting things. And I call this the epic family because the flavor is so epic. And I've got lots of different selections people have sent me. So just drop me an email with your address if you want to play around and find new varieties out of this that you can name and we can work towards releasing. Now I want to cover colors and flavors, and then we're going to take a little bit of a break for questions. But this will, and think about everything I've said in terms of helping you decide what to grow. Do you want heirlooms so you can save seeds and tell stories? Is that not as important to you? You want super productivity and you've got lots of disease issues, so you may want to stick with hybrids. And in the second half, we'll talk about the different plant growth habits and how that may influence. But after growing and trying somewhere over 4,000 different tomatoes in my 40 years, I can put my hand on my heart and say that I found no correlation between colors and flavors. But this is fun to explore on your own. And in this picture is Cherokee green in the upper left and Brandywine in the upper right, and Cherokee purple in the lower left, and red Brandywine in the lower center, and Cherokee chocolate in the lower right. So and this is where it becomes complex because you will each know in general what sort of tomato you like to eat, but you have your own particular set of taste buds, which may or may not match other people, your other family members. But so this is a generality. Do colors equal flavors? These are some of the ones that you would pick if you love a sweet tomato. And a Russian, a beautiful heart-shaped Russian variety in the upper left, really productive quite early and just a lovely flavored tomato. White Queen, which I got from the USDA seed bank and was released in the late 1930s by, I believe, the Earl May Seed Company. In the upper right, you've got the very popular Kellogg's breakfast, the beautiful orange fruit. I would consider that in the sweet side of things. This even purple ball on the lower left is the tomato to convince people that not all heirlooms are ugly, because this looks like a plant covered with pink tennis balls, without the fuzz, of course. Really nice, mild, sweet flavor. And the center below are one of countless, probably hundreds of the big red, yellow bicolor types. This one is Ruby Gold. That's from 1921 from the Child Seed Company. If you cut these open, you get yellow and red swirls, and every tomato on the plant is different in terms of the swirling and the coloring. When I cut up and eat a Ruby Gold, I think I'm eating a peach because it's very dense, it's very sweet, and it's very mild and fruity. That is not my favorite type of tomato, but it is incredible on a grilled cheese or a cheeseburger. And in the lower right is really North Carolina's only truly known heirloom, German Johnson. And that is a very mild, sweet pink variety. If you go to farmers markets in North Carolina, that is the heirloom that most vendors sell. Now we get into my favorite zone. When I eat a tomato, it's a tomato that I've dreamed about over the winter. It's a tomato whose flavor attacks my taste buds, and the flavor lingers in your mouth, and you just can't wait till they ripen. So maybe these tomatoes are not suitable for young taste buds for children, because that attack of that tomato flavor may be too much for them. Um, but Lillian's Yellow Heirloom, which is the one that I crossed with Cherokee Purple, I received that from a man named Robert Richardson in New York, who received them from an elderly lady, Lillian Bruce, in Tennessee. She got it from her sons, who would go to state fairs and look at the fruits and vegetables that were displayed and bring her specimens. So we don't know the origin of this, aside from the fact that Lillian Bruce loved it and shared it. The one in the upper right is Dwarf Barrel Beauty, one of our green fruited varieties from our dwarf project. And maybe that's another thing I should put my hand in my heart and say, I can find dwarf growing varieties from my project that have the flavors that are just as delicious as the best indeterminates. But like heirlooms, not all of them are great. And some of our dwarfs are just very good. Running the project, it's tough to be the parent that criticizes their children. But there are a few that are just not up to my very favorite flavor, but most of them are. Lower left is Nepal, which is actually a beautiful, perfectly formed 8-ounce red variety that is the first heirloom I ever grew back in 1987, and is the tomato that's responsibility from switching from the hybrids, the Whoppers and the Big Boys and the Better Boys, to heirlooms. And in the back of my book, Epic Tomatoes, I've actually put in the appendix all of the detail of a 3-year study I did comparing heirlooms and hybrids with yields and flavor ratings and all of that stuff. It's one of my favorite parts of the book, and I had to kind of twist Story's arm to get it in there. In the lower center is Rosella Purple, another one of our just spectacularly flavored dwarfs. This is probably the dwarf that seed companies run out of first and get asked for the most. It's become really popular. And then Cherokee Chocolate, which is the yellow skin version of Cherokee Purple that showed up as a mutation in my 1995 garden. Now, one interesting thing when I was selling seedlings all those years in Raleigh were so many people that came up to me and said, I don't want a sweet tomato, I want a tart tomato. Why can't you find really tart, sour tomatoes anymore? And it's because they've never really been all that common variety-wise. A lot of the larger slicing tomatoes tend to be on the sweet side, but you can find that tartness. And these are the types of tomatoes, if you went out with your grandparents on a weekend to a fruit stand, and you'd come home with a bag of tomatoes and you'd have a cookout and slice the tomatoes up and just have a great old time. Tiger Tom in the upper left, really, really tart. One that a lot of people know about, Green Zebra in the upper center. One that not many people know about at all, but should, is a Russian variety that I received in 1990 from the Seed Savers Exchange called a Zoichka in the upper right. And then in the lower left is one of our dwarfs that's white. kind of ivory colored, Dwarf Mr. Snow, one of the most tart tomatoes I've ever tasted. Another one of our dwarfs, Dwarf Blazing Beauty, and just a big old fashioned 1 pound heirloom red, acres, West Virginia. So hopefully with everything that we've talked about to this point, you have an idea on how you can search the catalogs to find the color that you want to grow. And you can always ask me what it tastes like, because I've probably grown most of them. Um, and whether you want to do heirlooms or hybrids and be a seed saver and tell stories. And now this is one of my favorite weirdo pictures I took. That's Marlon looking at a lucky cross while Sue reads a book. But this is halftime, and a good time for a 5-minute bio break if people need it, and to ask if one of my moderator friends will pick out a few of the appropriate questions and fire away.
Craig, this is Jenny, and I'm
Hi,
monitoring the question and answer icon.
great.
There's a question from April, and she says, what would you consider the meatiest varieties?
Oh gosh. So meatiness is quite variable, variety to variety. And I would say most of the heart-shaped types, so we're talking German red strawberry, Nicky Crane, Acres Oxheart, um, even Livingston's Oxheart, yellow Oxheart, you get the idea. It's the ones that are heart-shaped. They're really, really meaty. And what I love about them is people will say, what's your favorite sauce tomato? Which Roma type? I don't think Roma tastes very good. So what I like to use for my sauce are the really meaty heart-shaped ones. You do get some slicing types that are very meaty as well, such as Lillian's Yellow is so meaty that it's a seed saver's nightmare. You can pick a 1.5 pound tomato and get no more than 20 seeds out of it because it is almost solid flesh. Um, so if you stick to the ox hearts and of course the paste tomatoes, I would go with the long ones like speckled Roman and opalka because they tend that grow on indeterminate vines because they tend to have a much better flavor than the short growing types like Roma. But I hope that helps.
Sue asks, are dwarf varieties determinate or indeterminate?
Ah, we will get to that right in the first few slides. They combine to me the best traits of indeterminate in being the fact that they fruit until frost with the best trait of determinate in that it stays compact. But they are actually a third major variety of tomato that are not that well known yet because up until we started our project, there were maybe only 5 or 6. And now there's 167 and counting. So we're still in the process of educating the gardening public on what these dwarf tomatoes are, but that was a perfectly great question to ask. Thank you.
Tracy asks, given space constraints, is there a minimum number of F3 plants to grow to start stabilizing a variety?
It so this is another great question. You guys will have to have me back to talk tomato genetics and all that stuff someday. But so you've got your hybrid, which is uniform. Any seed in that hybrid will be the same tomato. So you only need to plant one of those and save lots of seeds. The F2 is where you get to the diversity. So grow as many of those as you can. So if your cross is wide, let's say you're crossing a white with an anthocyanin striped with variegated leaves, your F2 is going to be so diverse. And then if you're selecting for dominant traits, I'm sorry this is getting technical, but let's say the one you like the best has regular leaf foliage and it's red fruited, it's going to take less time to stabilize it than, sorry, backwards. It's going to take more time to stabilize the dominant traits than it is to stabilize the recessive. So in our project, when we come up with a potato leaf green or a potato leaf yellow, it stabilizes, it seems to stabilize within 3 or 4 generations. Whereas if we're going for a regular leaf red that had potato leaf in the heritage of it, it would take sometimes 7, 8, or 9 years. What I find is really good to do is find friends that are in a different growing zone than you. So when we were in the Dwarf Project, we loved using our Australian gardeners because we could fit two growing seasons into a calendar year, which halved our development time. But you can do the same thing with with our gardeners in Florida and Texas, where they can sometimes double season, or you can use greenhouses to do some of the work as well. So you can be really flexible with that. But that's another fantastic question that I've never been asked in my 10 years of doing these.
Brad asks, is there any connection between color and acid content?
That's the last slide of my show, but I will say right now, I'm going to break the teaser, but we will get to it. All tomatoes, no matter what the color, have essentially, within a margin of error, the same acidity. What varies really widely is the sugar content. So if you have a tomato that tastes really acidic, it means that it doesn't have that much sugar in to cover up that acid. That ruby gold that I described that tastes like a peach has the same amount of acidity, but the genetics code for a very high level of sugars in that tomato that mask the acidity. So that we'll get back to that at the end. What's good about that is if you're a canner, you can can anything you want together without having to worry about finding a green or a white or a yellow tomato that has low acidity. Now, this is a frequent problem you'll see at farmers markets where they advertise certain varieties as low acid pink and low acid yellow. And that's just a myth that has carried through for decades and decades that we're trying to hammer away at.
Gabrielle asks, are there heirlooms that are more disease resistant than others?
Oh, another great question. It's trial and error based on your garden and the weather that you get that year, because really it depends on, there's two contributing pieces to this. There's what are the various diseases in your area, in your garden soil that can blow in versus what is the natural tolerance or resistance to those diseases within the variety you're growing. So how I try to sort that out is if you want to grow this or that variety, look in garden message boards or ask friends if they've tried it and if they live in your area, have they had luck with it or not? Um, I've used trial and error over the years. So of the 4,000 varieties I've grown and tried, there are some that I just simply can't grow in my garden. Yellow pear, green zebra, they get diseased almost immediately for me. But I will say some, like Cherokee purple, Cherokee chocolate, red brandywine. I can provide a list for anybody who wants to email me. There are some that through trial and error I have found to resist or tolerate diseases better than others. And the diseases I'm referring to for my gardens are really septoria leaf spot and early blight and perhaps fusarium wilt. But I'm going to talk about all of these diseases later in the talk. So this is a good setup for what's coming. And maybe one more, Jenny, before we should get rolling on.
Sure. Peggy asks, what distance do you recommend to prevent cross pollination to keep the seed true?
Fantastic question. And as a seed saver who has crammed up to 150 varieties 2 feet apart in my garden, what I've gone to is which fruit and when to harvest to minimize crossing. So I've noticed that in my garden, there's very, very little bee activity when the weather's cool. And I've found that by limiting my seed saving to the very first low cluster of fruit on the plant, I'm achieving 98, 99+% purity. Whereas if you would go up and harvest fruits in the heat of the summer in August, higher up the plant, and they're very close, you may be looking at 70 to 75% purity. Tomatoes should pollinate as they open. So it's a timing thing. The bees have to get in there before the deed is done. And even 70% of the time, the tomatoes will do it. But when you start seeing potato leaf in your regular leaf variety or vice versa, you know you've had a bee visit. Now, that can be the start of some really interesting new varieties, depending on how adventurous you want to be. To be absolutely sure, and if you want to plant close, just get some thin fabric bags, little wedding favor bags, and loosely tied around the flower cluster before any of the flowers are open and secure the bottom of it so bees can't get in. let the flowers do their thing in the fruit form, and then market, because you can guarantee every tomato in that cluster will be 100% true. Another great question. So I think, Virginia, shall we roll on?
Yes, go right ahead.
Here we go. How do we make all this happen? Because it's one thing to talk about tomatoes and have us all salivating. It's another thing to how do we get there successfully? And we all know there's no guarantees in gardening, but what are those things we can do to help maximize our success? So a few slides to continue a little bit about the first topic in selecting. Size does matter in terms of your amount of sun exposure. If you want to grow a 2-pound mortgage lifter, that like that big tomato on the left, you better have 8 hours of direct sun or more. If you've only got 2 or 3 hours of sun on your back deck, you can grow a little tiny Mexico midget or a sun gold, and it will do quite well. So you can actually extrapolate. The larger the tomato you want to grow, the more hours of direct sun that it's going to need. So indeterminate varieties, thinking about what to choose, they're the unruly stepchildren of the garden. This is me at 6 feet tall, standing next to a Cherokee purple at 8 feet tall in early July in my Raleigh garden. Where's it going to go next? I have months till frost. So this is what indeterminate varieties do. And as I'll talk about later, you need some kind of a topping or caging or a suckering strategy for the indeterminate types. Determinate varieties are in the upper right. They're like a ball. They grow to about 3 feet. They're perfect for a cage. They burst into flowers. They shouldn't be pruned. You'll pick 25 pounds of fruit over a 2-week period, and that the plant says, I've done my job. I'm out of here. Dwarfs in the lower right stay the same compact height as determinate, but they continually produce flowers slowly along the stems that form. They shouldn't be sucker pruned. They can be foliage pruned, but a well-grown dwarf will give close to the same yield of fruit as a somewhat pruned, controlled, indeterminate variety. How to succeed really becomes all about understanding your weather and your dates. And of course, the most important date is, when do I put my tomatoes out? Once the threat of frost is past. And I'll talk in a moment about when I choose when to start my seeds to achieve that. The issues that we're dealing with today are the intensity of the sun and also what that does to developing flowers and fruit. And just this teeny little story, when I moved into Raleigh in 1992, we had 5 days of 90 or above. There were 87s and 88s and 89s, but 5 days of 90 or above. When we moved to Hendersonville in 2019, that summer in Raleigh, we had 72 days of 90 or above. And that was kind of a straight line going up throughout the 28 years that we lived in garden there. Now, why is this important? Direct sun is fantastic for tomatoes, but temperatures over 90 degrees for extended periods will prevent the flowers of the larger fruited tomatoes. We're talking 1 pound and above to abort and drop off the plant. So you need to either try to create a cooler microclimate by using a screening during the hot part of the day, or if you know you're going to get 95 degrees for weeks on end, adjust the timing of when you get the plants out so you get them flowering a good amount and get some fruit before you hit those hot temperatures, or plant in the heat of the summer and keep the plants healthy. And then at the tail end, when it cools off a little bit, you'll get your fruit. Cherry tomatoes don't seem to be bothered by the super hot temps. And again, like an extrapolated line, as you work up fruit size, it really jumps to catastrophic when your tomatoes are in the 1 to 1.5 pound range. And you can look at your plant and see gaps of yield, and you can read your weather from there. The effect of hotter, more humid temperatures also affects which diseases hit and how hard, which critters visit your garden, and they do impact your culture and care. So flip side, what makes tomato plants happy? They like warm roots. So if you put tomato plants in cold soil, they'll sit there and look at you until the roots warm up. They love adequate water. If you allow your plants to become visibly stressed on hot days you can see them wilting, they will provide you with fruit with blossom end rot. That is the most common affliction of stressed tomatoes. They love good drainage. They love regular feeding. They're kind of moderate feeders, and you can read the foliage to decide if your tomato is happy or not. And they love regular attention. That's how you spot the tomato hornworms or the stink bugs or the blemish foliage that shows an onset of a disease. So here's what I use as my mnemonic to help me with planting time. And I start on the right, my plant out date, and since we moved to Hendersonville, is May 1st, which means I'm going to be transplanting up from a teeny seedling to a mid-sized pot on April 1st, which means I aim to plant my seeds on March 1st. And I've been using this. And of course, you would adjust this to whatever your plant out date is going to be. And I've used this for about 35 years and it's never failed me. A few things about seed starting. It is absolutely okay to plant thickly. And this is a method that I I didn't discover it. I thought about it and I thought, why not? And then I certainly popularized it, which is the dense planting technique. And I now use this pretty much for everything. So some key parameters for successful seed starting are a good sterile mix, a a soilless seed starter. My favorites are SunGrow propagation mix or Metro Mix 830, but there are a zillion of them. Every potting mix company puts out a good sterile seed starter. The reason you want to start with a sterile seed starter is one of the worst problems that can happen with young seedlings is damping off. So you don't want to induce fungal issues right when the seed pops up and then it gets chopped off. Another thing to know is tomato seeds last for many years, up to 12 to 15, just you can't really see it. No, you sure you can. I've got coin envelopes of seeds behind me on the shelf, and I'll get 70, 80, 90% germination up to about 12 years, and I'll still get some lingering germination up to about 15 years. So you get a packet of 25 seeds, and you only plant 5, don't throw the rest away. They'll be good for a long time. So I put the sterile mix in. I used 50 cell plug flats, put in the mix, water it, and then I surface sow. Um, and we sold seedlings in Raleigh and I had no greenhouse. So I was up to 50 seeds per cell and I've done more and it works out fine. I've used it for lettuce and greens. I've used it for eggplant, and pepper, and herbs and flowers. The only thing I don't use the dense planting is for really large seeded things that grow fast, like beans and corn. It even works well for beets. It even works for carrots. Shh, I've tried it and it actually does. And then you just sprinkle dry potting mix on the top to just cover the seeds. Then you mist, and I put a loose sheet of saran wrap on and put them on a very inexpensive heat mat that just bumps the soil temperature up. And this is one of the flats sitting on a heat mat. The seeds were planted February 28th. So this is day 6. Generally, I'll get germination of tomato seed in 3 to 4 days, and I think that bottom heating and the shallow planting does the trick. So once the seedlings germinate, the plastic, of course, has to come off, and you need to get them into light of some sort. We could go into a lot of detail about seed starting. If you have any questions about that, we can ask it at the end, and I think I do have some extra slides at the back if we have time. So let's say you have an in-ground garden. And when we lived in our house in Raleigh, I hand dug this garden. Then over time, the trees grew and my son lessened and I had to go to container and straw bale gardening. Plants hate wet feet. So if you dig holes for your tomatoes and it rains and the water just sits there for hours and hours, your plant's not going to like it because you'll have your plants in the ground, you'll get a rainstorm and that bowl of water will fill up and it will look like your plants are thirsty because they're wilting when they're actually suffocating. So you need to dig up your hard pan, you need to get your drainage really good. Mulching is easy and important and should never be skipped because this keeps your soil from splashing onto the lower leaves. It can also warm the soil, and I use a breathable mulch like untreated grass clippings that will break down and feed the plant a little bit. But you could use shredded wood chips or shredded newspaper. You could use plastic if you have lots of slits cut in it. The key is don't let the soil, which has all kinds of disease spores of many types, splash onto those lower leaves. Always water at the base of the plant, not from above, because wet foliage acts as a magnet for all of those little spores that are floating around the garden and will provoke an onset of disease. And the other thing about overhead watering is a lot of it evaporates and not much of it will get where it's needed at the root system. So I just water at the bottom of the plant. Um, as far as containers are concerned, anything goes. Terracotta, fake terracotta, which is that rear brownish one is. I've had these for 30 years. Grow bags, which are a great convenience. And I love the black plastic ones. I've had them for 10 or 15 years. They come pre-punched with holes in the bottom. You can get them for less than $1 each. I don't want to fill up landfills with plastic. So I just keep them and keep them and reuse them and reuse them. The place I buy my grow bags is Peaceful Valley on the West Coast, and it is groworganic.com. That's Peaceful Valley Farm Supply, and they've got a great selection of grow bags of many sizes. What's most important about container gardening is what you put in the containers. You need a really good quality potting mix. I've gone through various brands. We have something called Super Sod Big Yellow Bag out here, which is compost. Um, I've used soilless mixes such as the Miracle Grow potting mix or the Stay Green potting mix that I get at Lowe's. Avoid anything that says garden soil and potting soil because they're very heavy with clay and they don't drain well, and they can just have issues with diseases. So go with the potting mix and use a 3-to-1 mixture mixed with a compost such as black cow manure. Can I reuse the planting mix? If the tomatoes or other crops you grow in your grow bags and containers grow well that year, absolutely. You just need to boost up with some food the next year. If your plants suffer from the typical fungal diseases that get in the foliage like septoria and early blight, sure, you can still use that. That comes from elsewhere. If your plant gets a really dire root-bound disease, such as fusarium wilt, then you need to toss that grow bag's worth of soil, maybe mulch your flower beds with it or use it elsewhere, but not the tomato family crops. So this is what the taller trees in my side garden drove me to do. And yes, my neighbors thought I was insane, but um, I fought the HOA by killing them with kindness by asking them if they wanted any tomato plants or tomatoes or zucchinis. So this was the year I had 225 containers, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, grew a ton of produce in my driveway. I watered it once a day with a hose and it only took 20 minutes because I had everything set up boringly in lines, but it was convenient. Let's touch briefly on straw bale gardening. It's magical. I look at a straw bale now and I think this is going to be 2 20-gallon containers worth of perfect loam once it's conditioned. And you grow in it. And conditioning means using heavy applications of a nitrogen fertilizer. There are organic or traditional methods of doing the conditioning every other day for a week, and then watering every day, and then going with a high dose of the balanced fertilizer, like a 10-10-10, and then watering. If you start this processing today, in 2 weeks, you can plant your bales. I like wheat straw. There is a finite but low risk of getting a wheat straw bale that has been contaminated with persistent herbicides, but I have fear that it is an increasing risk, so it's better to try to get certified organic bales if you want. This is what it looks like. You don't add any dirt to a straw bale when you're growing seedlings. You just create a furrow and you plop your plant in and maybe use a cup or two of planting mix just to fill it in. So this is the tomatoes, and the mushrooms are fun to watch. They're harmless. They disappear every time the sun comes out. Container gardening and straw bale gardening do need more attention to watering. I actually water containers and straw bales daily when we get into the heat of the summer. They're both perfect to set up for drip irrigation or soaker hose, so you can automate that. I like to feed my plants in containers and straw bales weekly with just an all-purpose fertilizer. Um, so I use just like a blue stuff dissolved up, 1 tablespoon per gallon, and put a cup and a half on each plant once a week, and everything grows great. So look at the date, May 8th, 2 weeks after planting. So the heat that's generated by the interior of the bale warms the roots and really pushes the plants. You can direct seed in straw bales as well. And I've been harvesting summer squash and green beans from direct planted seeds. You would put a 2-inch layer of potting mix on the top and then plant the seed into that. 35 to 40 days from planting the seed. So you can really, really push the maturity dates on your crops using these. And this is what it looks like in my backyard garden where everything's planted out. If you want to know why I have straw bales and containers on this big backyard, it's because our septic system is back there. And this is the only way I can safely garden without damaging our septic system. But it elevates the plants up into the air where it's easier for me to reach and I can observe their growth. Suckering strategy. Every indeterminate tomato plant will put out a sucker everywhere that a stem and a leaf intersect, all the way up the plant. If you let a sucker develop, it becomes a stem that suckers in itself. So I pick a number. Last year, I let 3 suckers go on each of my indeterminate plants. So I had 4 fruiting stems per plant, and I tied 2 of them to a stake. So each straw bale had 1 plant, 2 stems each, 2 stakes, and they grew vertically beautifully, and they didn't crowd out. I had good sun and air exposure. But all you need to do as suckers find that growth. So going with only 3 suckers and 1 main stem, I was suckering every other day. What's great is if people come into your yard and they love your sun gold and they don't have one, you can just let one of the sun gold suckers grow to 4 to 6 inches and stick it in a glass of water. It will root in about a week, pot it up for them, and they have a clone of your sun gold that they can enjoy. Suckers can also be potted up and used for succession planting. If you're worried that critters might get into your garden or disease may hit, you can have a healthy set of seedlings coming along behind your main ones. If you don't sucker, you get yield and you get chaos. And so these were not topped well or pruned well. And I have chairs and tables and sawhorses holding plants up. It yielded fine. The problem is you're creating areas where disease can spread plant to plant and critters can get in underneath. So I told Joe Lample when we did our Growing Epic Tomatoes course that I was going to really pay attention to suckering and topping when we did the filming, and I did. And so this is a garden the next year at about the same maturity where when the plants got to the top of the stake, I just snipped it. And I limited the number of stems I had growing per plant. I use 8-foot metal core stakes and I use twine to tie them. Just a few disease pictures because we're all going to know them and it's good to recognize them. Early blight is a fungus that's everywhere. It blows onto your wet foliage when your plants are wet from rain, and you get the distinctive bullseye appearance. Septoria leaf spot is also a fungus and does the same thing, except it produces little brown specks. And on the backside of these leaves are the spores. So the important thing to do is check your plants regularly, and if you see leaves with blemishes, get them off the plant. That will really, really diminish the spread of that disease, of those 2 diseases. Neither one of these will kill a plant, but they will actually spread like wildfire, and your plants will be defoliated and your fruit quality will be very poor. A more difficult disease is one that's in the soil. And you spot this when you're looking at your plants and everything looks great, but one day you notice it's wilted despite being watered. That's the one on the left. And then the next day you go out and you see the foliage is starting to turn bright yellow. That's Fusarium wilt. It is a fungus that blocks the water transportation from going up into the stem from the root. So it attacks through the ground at the roots. The plants might as well be pulled because they'll be very, very unproductive. There's a chance that Fusarium wilt could end up in the seed coat of the seeds of the fruit that do ripen. But the most important thing is you now know in that spot of your garden, Fusarium exists. So if you want to garden there, you either need to rotate away from it or maybe put down a piece of landscape fabric and use a container or a straw bale to keep the roots from getting in to the soil and infecting the plant. Tomato hornworms, they're fun. They eat a lot. They gross you out, and they're often hard to find. I'm sure many of you know this, but if they've got those ricey looking attachments, that's the pupa of a parasitic wasp that will eat that hornworm from the inside out and produce more wasps. So you leave the ones with the rice, you remove the others, and if you can't find them, you just get yourself a battery operated UV black flashlight, and you go out at night and you risk your neighbors thinking you're a marauder or somebody crazy, but your plants light up purple and the hornworms light up green. So it's the way to locate those hornworms that are eating your plant to smithereens, but you can't find it. These are physiological, meaning they're not caused by disease, but by growing conditions. Blossom end rot comes on because of stress, and stress, usually because the plants are being inadequately watered or fed, interrupt the calcium uptake of the plant from the soil. And if you really water your plant well and keep the plants healthy and well fed, you'll see very, very little, but you won't actually completely eliminate it because any given plant will feel stressed at certain times of the growing season, particularly that first cluster when the plant is growing and the weather is warming and the flowers are forming and the fruit are growing. Usually it is a problem that works itself out if you keep the plants fed and watered. Cracking happens. Sometimes there's a genetic tendency. The way fruits crack is telling. This is radial cracking. If the cracking is around the stem, it's called concentric cracking. And that is one way to tell the authentic Cherokee purple, which radial cracks, with imposter Cherokee purple, which is probably black crim and radial cracks. There's a lot of mix-ups in various seed companies in terms of exactly what they're selling. So what you do is cracking will happen when you let the fruit sit on the plant until it's ripe, and then you get a big rainstorm or you water. So if you pick the fruit at breaker stage, which means the bottom half is coloring up, the top half is green, then let it ripen on your counter. You won't get the cracking, but the fruit will completely ripen in a few days and they will taste indistinguishable from fully ripened tomatoes on the vine. Hard to believe, but absolutely true. And Joe Lample and I have experimented with this so many times. We've done blind tastings. It works. And if you let them hang on the vine, this is what you get. Lots of different types of cracks. And when tomatoes crack like that, they can start to rot, fruit flies get in, and it reduces your shelf life. Very quick, just a few sides on seed saving. Get a tomato that's at the ripe stage you would eat, cut it in half, squish the contents into a cup, let it sit somewhere warm and out of the sun where you don't mind a terrible smell that will develop. I cover my cups with paper towels and weigh them down with a tray to keep the flies out. The fungus layer that forms is great. That means that gel layer surrounding each seed is being eaten away. That protects the germination inhibitor. So if you don't get these within a few days of that fungus forming, you could have a cup of little tomato seedlings. So just let it get a few days, bring them in, fill the cup with water, stir it. All the good seeds sink. All the stuff that you don't want to keep floats, and you can just decant it off and do that a few times. You end up with nice, almost clear water, the bottom right. Seeds, sieve them, put them on a labeled paper plate, let them air dry for a few days, and then you now have your own saved tomato seeds that you can save in any number of ways: coin envelopes, plastic vials, glass bottles, glassine envelopes that will last you a good 10 to 15 years. If you put them in the fridge and don't let air in, you may get 25 years out of them. If you put them in the freezer, you may get 50 years. And I've come back to the tomato acidity, the question that was asked early on. Any tomato you grow can be canned because the pH of all varieties, this is a test that the USDA did in the 1960s, testing somewhere about 500 tomatoes of every conceivable color, shape, and size. The pH range was minuscule. So there are no low acid tomatoes, but there are high sugar tomatoes. Just have fun and pick the ones that you love to eat and love to can. So why am I here on this calm, lovely Thursday evening talking to you about one of my favorite things? Because my grandfather Walter on the left, this is him at his 50th wedding anniversary, and my dad on the right, that's Wilfred, with me when I was probably one. They showed me the gardens that they grew, and they described to me what they were growing, and they planted a seed that took decades to germinate, but it worked. And so each of you have a job to grow a gardener. Bring people into your garden, tell them what you're doing, grow some heirlooms, tell them the stories, let them taste what you're growing. And we need to keep replenishing gardeners. When I joined the Seed Savers Exchange in 1986, it was with a whole other bunch of people around my age that were captivated by heirlooms, and many of us are starting to disappear. And we're not sure if we've replaced ourselves sufficiently, because a lot of people are growing a lot of these wild, crazy hybrids, or it's all about the antho varieties. There's always going to be somebody that needs to take care of the old heirloom varieties that trace back over 100 years. So that's what we hope, that this talk will captivate a few of you or many of you to do that. So those are my two books. Amazon sells them. They're at bookstores. You can contact me if you want signed copies. That's that. I am working on the Dwarf Tomato Breeding Project book. Whether I self-publish it or go with a publisher will probably be determined in the next few weeks. And there is my website for my blog, and I have a big frequently asked questions section. My speaking events, a lot of the Dwarf Tomato Breeding Project, my email. The Instagram is where I'm the most active right now. There's a lot of dog and baby pictures, but once we're gardening, those will be replaced with tomatoes, dog and baby pictures. And then Joe Lamplin and I did this course, Growing Epic Tomatoes, which is still out there and live and available to be signed up for. It's all video, it's all self-paced. It takes people months to go through it. And you can see the link to it there. And I've talked about the Dwarf Tomato Breeding Project. So thank you. That's how to reach me. I hope everybody got something out of this they can use. I'm going to put this slide up because it has, if someone were to tie me up and torture me and say, you must tell me your favorite tomatoes to grow for flavor only, this is my current list, and it changes a little bit all the time. So my KC friends, my moderator friends, all of you watching, thank you so much for joining me and listening to me babble on about one of my obsessions in life, my tomatoes. And I'm willing to stick around and answer any questions that you have.
Craig, this is Jenny. That was great. We have a lot of questions that are still here. So I'm going to read them off to you. And I believe we have been moving some over to the answered pile. So hopefully it won't be repeats. An anonymous attendee asks, I raise my indeterminates vertically on weed whacker line and clip on the main stem. I find it works well. It keeps the plants more disease free, but wondering if I can improve this technique or if you can suggest a better one.
Wow. I'll tell you what, with that one, there are as many ways to grow indeterminates as there are gardeners on this call. So for Anonymous, if you're still there, please send me an email and send me some pictures. And I'd like to have a little bit of dialogue with you about that, share what I do, and then maybe we can post things back to the notes at this event, because that one would take probably 15 or 20 minutes alone to go through, but it's a great question. We're always looking for better ways to grow indeterminate varieties, but I want to hear more about what you did. So thanks for that.
A Zoom user asked, says, excuse me, I live in northwestern Pennsylvania and I planted my tomatoes in late May. My slicer tomatoes all ripen nicely, but my paste tomatoes set green on the vine almost the entire season. And by the time they started to ripen, the frost killed them. What could be the reasons for this? Is there something I can do to help them ripen?
Um, it's just really all about variety selection because paste tomatoes actually are almost all mid-season, but there are, you probably got a few later ones. I know San Marzano, if that's the one you're growing, tends to be on the late side. But if you look through a catalog like Johnny's or Pine Tree, Victory, um, gosh, Tomato Grower Supply, I would pick your paste tomatoes based on maturity dates and aim for something that comes in at 55, 60, 65 days. I think for you, since paste tomatoes tend to all taste pretty similar, it's going to be about finding early maturity rather than flavor. And again, if you want to email me and ask for my help specifically to choose some varieties for you, do that. But it really is varieties, the maturity dates of the varieties you're growing.
Steve in Stanford, North Carolina says, what are the best varieties for clay?
Any. And you're in Sanford. I grew for 28 years in Raleigh and I could grow everything. So clay, clay is a pain because it's hard and it's full of rocks and you have to break it up. But once you break it up, clay retains water and nutrients very well. So really for you, and I have to say in Sanford, a shout out for big bloomers. We used to buy almost all of our flowers at this wonderful farm in Sanford. Um, I would say it's all about garden preparation, but the sky is the limit. You should be able to grow any variety that catches your imagination. Just break up that clay so that you get good drainage and you'll have really good results.
Gabrielle, oh boy, here's something I hear about. I am plagued with Asian jumping worms.
Oh
Any
my
suggestions
gosh.
on how to actually grow healthy tomato plants in that kind of soil?
Asian jumping worms. Well, as you can imagine, this is the first time of this for me. And I would, if anybody can go to chat or any of you master gardeners, have you guys, I've never had to deal with them and no one's ever asked me about them. Have you guys dealt successfully with them before? Anything that anybody, either Tamara or Virginia or Sharon, if you guys know, or if you can, somebody can put something in the chat that's worked, because that's one I would like to research and get back. So I would ask Gabrielle to send me an email so I can put on my thinking cap.
Okay, we have an anonymous attendee says, could you please address the nutritional value of various types of tomatoes?
Oh gosh. From what I've studied, tomatoes are, if they're well grown, um, they're all pretty equally nutritious in terms of having, they're mostly water. I'm not sure if the percentage is 92, but you've got myriad compounds, xanthophylls, and all these different things that make them really healthy, trace amounts of the various vitamins. So I am someone who has terrible knees, um, arthritic knees, torn cartilages, and all that. I eat tomatoes breakfast, lunch, and dinner from June until September. And my view is eat them, eat as many of them as you can. Now, I have read where tomatoes will release more of certain of their nutrients when they're cooked in sauces, but that cooking also may reduce other nutrients. So I can't really speak specifically except to say, and you do know botanically it's a fruit. So it's the fruit that gets eaten the most in our house. And anything that delicious and so versatile, it just makes you happy. So it has to be good for you.
Uh, Riley asks, can you cross tomatoes with, this is interesting, can you cross tomatoes with other fruits or vegetables?
Um, you can't by using traditional Mendelian genetics. However, there is a tomato that's in development. Well, I think a seed company mistakenly released it as a GMO variety and then withdrew it almost immediately. But there are some tomatoes that have been engineered by taking out a gene of, I think it's a snapdragon, and inserting it into the tomato, which produces a dark purple flesh interior. But in terms of crossing tomatoes with peppers or peppers with eggplant, and even things like watermelons with cucumbers, these different species are pretty distinct, and you won't get crossing unless you start clipping away at the genes and doing insertions and things like that.
Lynn asks, would you tell us again which dwarf tomato is your favorite?
Oh, my favorite. Oh, yeah. Here we go. This is, and I didn't whip this up in 2 seconds after you asked the question. It was sitting here all the time. My current favorite dwarf tomatoes for flavor. So, and if I'm perusing this, Sweet Scarlet Dwarf is simply incredible, and it's scarlet red. I would say Dwarf Glorious Treat is the tomato that's catching the most attention right now. It is potato leaf, 1 to 1.25 pounds. Now, this is a 3 to 4 foot plant with 1.25 pound yellow heart-shaped tomatoes that have red swirls that hit a 9 out of 10 on the flavor scale. So I, I think over the years, Dwarf Glorious Treat is going to be many, many, many people's favorite. Anybody who likes the indeterminate green giant would love Dwarf Emerald Giant, which we use green giant to breed that one. Dwarf Sweet Sue is the yellow. And the last one on there, Dwarf Eagle Smiley, many people think it's almost as delicious as Sun Gold. I mean, nothing tastes exactly like Sun Gold. It's so unique. But Dwarf Eagle Smiley is a yellow dwarf growing cherry tomato that is absolutely delicious, and it yields a ton. So any of those in that list should bring, delight to the palate for sure.
This is another trellising question,
Mm.
but iPad Sue's question is, what is the best way to trellis determinate tomatoes?
Yeah. So determinants, really, the absolute best way is to use the useless tomato cage. Yeah, what I mean is the 3 to 4 foot tall cone-shaped wire cages that if we plant an indeterminate in it, it goes up the top of the plant in about 2 weeks. The 4 foot ones are absolutely perfect for determinants, and you don't really need to do anything else to them. Maybe put a center stake in to secure that cage into the ground, but just let it fill up and become a cage of tomatoes. And anybody who's not grown the variety Taxi, Johnny sells it. Other people sell it, I'm sure, maybe Pine Tree. It is a determinate bright yellow 4 to 5 ounce tomato that is always the first one to ripen. Absolutely delicious. And it's one of my go-to canning tomatoes because you get so many of them at the same time and the flavor is so good. But yeah, just stick it in a cage. And the other thing about determinants is they should never be pruned because the flowers form in a different area on determinants. They come off the leaf branches. So if you start pruning off leaves and suckers, you will really, really knock the potential yield of that plant down. So dwarfs and determinants don't prune. There's one more exception. Dwarfs, the foliage is so thick that I have been known to foliage thin them a little bit, not removing flowers, but just snapping off some flowering branches at the inside of the plant to let a little more air through and a little more sun. If you've never grown a dwarf variety, they're just drop dead gorgeous plants. Everybody wants to come and ask you what you're growing, but they are very densely foliaged for sure.
Seymour asks, you may have mentioned this before, is one of the parents of a dwarf a determinate? Is that how they grow to a limited height?
So what we do is um, I'm going to just do this quick. So the very first dwarf tomato known, which appeared as a mutation, was a variety called Delay, which appeared in a palace garden in France in the 1840s and was sold in a few American seed catalogs. From that, a company developed Dwarf Champion, which came out in the 1880s, which was about a 3-ounce pink. And then Burpee developed Golden Dwarf Champion in the 1890s, which was a 3-ounce yellow. And then the Livingston Company developed Dwarf Stone in 1905, which was about an 8-ounce red. And then for whatever reason, the dwarf varieties were almost completely ignored. Tom Wagner bred a really good one in the 1970s called Lime Green Salad. But when we developed the Dwarf Tomato Breeding Project, they left this whole area unfilled for us. So we started looking at all of our favorite indeterminates, the Cherokee Purples and the Kellogg's Breakfasts and such. And then we only had these handful of dwarfs to cross them onto. And then now we've got 167 dwarfs. So to further these and create new ones now, we can actually cross indeterminate varieties with our own dwarfs. And dwarf is a recessive trait. So when you grow out the F2, 25% of your seedlings are dwarf. But then once you grow out one of those dwarfs, that's stable. You'll get dwarfs 100% of the time. I can provide a link to you guys. I did a talk on the Dwarf Tomato Breeding Project that has a lot of genetics that's on my link tree. I'm not sure what group I gave it to, or OSSI maybe out in Oregon, but I can make sure, Jenny, that you have that link so people can watch that if they wish.
Great, thank you. Gina asked a question. I have to confess, I'm interested in this too. Burpee came with the direct sow tomato offering this year. It's in the catalog. What are your thoughts about this, pro or con?
My thoughts are any tomato can be direct seeded. In fact, there's a whole form of gardening called winter sowing, where people use milk jugs and other protective and just direct seeds in. It really becomes about maturity dates and knowing your timing. So, if I were forced to admit what I think, I would say kindly that all seed companies, particularly those that are the real big ones, Parks and Harris and Burpee, they're always looking for an edge, and your seed dollar, it's extremely competitive who you shop from. So my initial impression is it's somewhat gimmicky, but I'll confess that I've not tried it. I've noticed that grafting tomatoes was a big thing some years ago, and that's quite expensive and and labor intensive. And that hasn't really caught on what I like. So seed companies are trying to find an edge. They put something out there. Remember the topsy-turvy tomato thing that people grow the tomato with and it hangs down? Let's see how long it lasts, and let's see what the feedback is on it. And that's what I'll be watching for, is to see what people think.
Randy asks, how do we sign up or register to plant and pollinate to become one of your test sites?
Yeah, well, you just drop me an email and we'll have a little chat about it. And then I look and see what's needed to be grown out. And then you get some seeds, and then we just communicate throughout the year. When I do my Instagram lives, usually I'll do them weekly, and then that's when I have typically a lot of discussion about what I'm growing and what the opportunities are. I'm sitting here in mid-January. I haven't yet put my mind around what I'm sending out this year, but I do know I have 125 emails in one of my Google Mail folder of people that have asked for seeds. So if you want to jump in and join, we've got some fascinating things to work on. And we're going to need some help. And we're talking about variegated foliage, potato leaf foliage, swirls, stripes. So we've done the easy stuff. And now I want to start branching out and doing some of the wild stuff, fuzzy leaves, chartreuse fuzzy leaves with variegation. So anyway, drop me an email, nctomatoman@gmail.com, introduce yourself, and we'll talk.
Chuck Miller asked me, will I be able to watch this again from the recording? Chuck, yes, you can. To find the information about that, please go into the chat, and one of the other hosts can put that back in there so that you and others can find that information. Sue says, what is the best way to store the seeds so they last at least 10 years?
I just do coin envelopes in my office, and if you do have, if you do run an air conditioner, a heat pump, that's good to keep the humidity in your house lower. So the enemy of seeds is moisture. If you have a really humid house, then you may want to store them in the little plastic envelopes that you can squeeze the tops together. But in my house, I find coin envelopes give me 12 to 15 years of duration, which is fine for my needs. And since I've had so much rare stuff come through my hands, my goal is always, if I'm growing it, make sure somebody else is growing it. If I'm growing it and it's really great and has a story, make sure a seed company is selling it. So I'm always looking for fail safes. I don't want to be responsible for a great tomato going extinct under my care. So I am definitely a distributor. And but that was a great question. Thanks for that. They were all great questions.
But wait, there's more. Kim asks, can straw be used as a mulch around tomatoes?
Absolutely. Yeah, straw's great. You know, So I've used straw, I've used the grass clippings, and I've used the shredded bark. So any of those have worked well. So the key to any effective mulch is that water can seep through when it rains or you water, and that air can get through. Um, so really, it's just an air and water permeable block for soil bouncing up and getting on the lower leaves of your foliage. So that straw would work fine.
Stephen and Deb both ask about the size of grow bags. What do you
Mhm.
recommend?
Great. If you really wanted to get, I mean, I've grown indeterminate tomatoes in 5-gallon grow bags with 2 gallons of planting mix and gotten decent yields, but I'm watering them twice a day and feeding them twice a week. So you're almost treating them like hydroponics at that point. You don't have a lot of root zones, so you're trying to make sure the plant survives that. But I would recommend 7 gallon minimum for indeterminates, with 10-gallon being kind of a sweet spot to maximize yield. And 5-gallon is a good size for peppers, eggplants, dwarf tomatoes, and determinate tomatoes to get really good yields. Now, I help take care of a local veteran-run farm, and we put dwarfs in the ground, which is the first time I really get to see what these things can do in the ground. Like anything, the more root space you give it, the more you will get. And I swear we had a few dwarf varieties that gave us 30 pounds of fruit off a plant that was only 4 feet tall. So if you plant a dwarf in a 5-gallon dwarf bag, you'll get 12, 15 pounds or more. The more you feed it and the more you water it, the more healthy you keep it, the better it will do. The caveat being, we've got 167 varieties. What we don't know is which of these will thrive in Washington State or struggle in Florida or be everybody's favorite in Pennsylvania or just not do well in Arizona. Because we did this as an all volunteer project and just gave them to seed companies, what we'll learn over the next 10 or 20 years is, of those 167, can we start now focusing on which ones are adapted best to growing in different regions? And all of you who grow these are part of that data if you feed that back to companies like Victory.
Craig Anonymous asks, what is the says fertilizer powder you put on top of the straw bales, maybe the conditioning.
Yeah,
Uh,
so I use, so how I, if people ask me what kind of a gardener I am, I would say I tend toward organic, but I'm not strictly there yet. So I will use a granular 10-10-10. I'm not growing my vegetable garden in the ground, so I'm not so concerned of building up a garden soil over 20 years with tons of organic matter. I'm just trying to get a season of tomatoes in my straw bales or grow bags. So I will use a granular 10-10-10. I will. Um, so I'm going to give you both the traditional and the organic methods to do this. To condition your bales, you could get Lowe's and Home Depot sell them. They're lawn starters, and usually the numbers are something like 2804. I mean, a lot of nitrogen. You don't want to weed and feed, of course. You don't want to you don't want to dump a lot of 2,4-D weed killer into it. So it's just pure nitrogen with a little bit of NPK, a little bit of potassium. If you were strictly organic, you could use Milorganite, you could use fish emulsion, you could use blood meal. So there's always an organic solution to this. And then for the second conditioning, I would use a granular 10-10-10, but you've got a fantastic company that sells Espoma, that sells things like tomato tone and plant tone. So you could use the organic plant tone, which is like about a 5-5-5, and use that to condition the straw bales for the balanced food. And then throughout the year, I'm using just the blue crystallized Miracle Grow potting mix, dissolving it up a tablespoon per gallon, and each plant gets a cup and a half each week. Um, it's just the way I do it, and it's worked for me. It doesn't mean it's the best way, doesn't mean it's the chosen way. One of the things about gardeners is it's filled with urban legends, and my grandpa did it that way. There's really no right or wrong. It's whatever you're comfortable with. What you want to avoid with gardening is the definition of insanity. If something's just not working for you, you do need to change something, even if it's a passed down family tradition to grow things a certain way. So be a scientist out there, play with it, try different things. You know, for tomatoes and stuff, you've always got an email to me to ask or chime in on one of my Instagram lives. But my goal is to just help people garden. That's it, pure and simple.
Craig, do you want to run until about 9:45 your time? Is
Yeah,
that
we can do that.
Yeah, we'll do a few more here. Is the use This is interesting. Jeff asks, is the use of a Brix meter, BRIX meter, an effective method for determining ripeness?
It can be if so. Brix measures the sugars in a tomato, and or brie. I guess it's pronounced Brix. They use it in France to check out how much sugar in the grape, so they know when to pick. So let's take the variety Sun Gold. What you'd want to do is take it and taste it at different stages. So the nice thing about Sun Gold is if it's light orange, it's nice and tart. It's very delicious. If it's medium orange, it's a flavor explosion. If it's dark orange, it tastes like a tropical fruit. Then use the Brix meter to measure the sugar at each of those three stages. Then you can kind of determine where your sweet spot is. But then to make the experiment even more interesting, you'll find that Brix can not always tell the truth of what you're looking for, because if a tomato doesn't have that much sugar, the acidity is really popping. You can be fooled depending on the acid sugar levels and varieties. But I think I've not used it as a tool yet. I know my friend Jen Joy does on Mr. and Mrs. Tomato Head on their tomato show that they do. Um, it's funny. I'm a scientist that doesn't use a lot of gadgets, doesn't use a lot of tools. I still try to almost garden like my father and grandfather and keep it inexpensive and enjoyable and not too technical, so that I can really spend most of my time reading the plants and understanding what they need and how they grow and stuff. And I love food. I love to cook. So one thing that I need to say, tomatoes are not always going to be a great success for you every year. So for example, in every 10-year period, I'll have one or two spectacular seasons, five pretty good seasons, and maybe two or three unmitigated disasters. And it's because typically the weather and your ability to care for them that year, whether you've gotten busy. So I think tomato growers and gardeners in general are happiest when we learn to love the journey we go along, from flipping through the catalogs to planting the seeds and watching them germinate, transplanting for a day in the garage and getting your hands all with that nice smelling potting mix, and getting them into the garden and watching them grow. Sometimes I think the harvesting and eating, it's not the least exciting part, but you can't focus solely on that, or else it will be a disappointing season, whereas you've learned so much in the journey along the way. So this is just an old dude that's been doing this for 40 years trying to share with you what I find the most enjoyable. And I just enjoy every step of the journey of gardening.
Craig Sherrill asks, what is a good place to buy seeds for dwarf tomato project for?
Yeah, Victory. So Victory releases all of them. I'm trying to think if there's other sources that I recommend at this point. I think Restoration is starting to carry a bunch. Adaptive Seeds has some, Renaissance Farm. Um, but you need to know that all of these other companies that are selling them probably have gotten them from a Victory seed packet. So, I mean, that's good. Victory's happy with that. But I would say get a variety that you like the sound of, and then just Google it and see who's got it. I'm really sad that Pine Tree doesn't carry any yet, or Johnny's actually had Tasmanian chocolate for a season, and then they don't have any. I know Southern Exposure Seed Exchange carries a couple. They haven't caught on yet because I think people need to grow them, enjoy them, and start asking for them. And then once people start asking for them from their favorite seed company, then they'll start to show up more. But you've got a few excellent sources, and that's really a good place to start.
Logan asks, is there an estimated time of arrival on the dwarf tomato book?
3 years ago. Um, here's my problem. When I wrote Epic Tomatoes and growing vegetables and straw bales, I signed contracts that had hard dates on them, and I was excited to get that information out, and that's led to, so Epic Tomatoes came out in 85. I mean, no, sorry, 2015. Here it is, 2025. This is its 10-year anniversary. And it led to so much other busyness that for me to sit down in front of a laptop and type for hours just hasn't been in the cards for me yet. I'm too busy on Instagram talking to all you guys, or so I need some self-discipline. But I'm talking to Chelsea Green publisher. I've talked to Story and they were interested in it, but they wanted to dictate too much of the book. They wanted me to quote, dumb it down, unquote, and leave out a lot of what I think is really fascinating about the project because their sole purpose will be to sell books. I don't care how much money it makes. My purpose is to tell the story. And so I'm trying to find a company to publish it that is more interested in the information and the story it tells and not as interested. And that's why I think self-publishing is a possibility. But I'm hoping by the end of the year, I can say, okay, it will be released on date X if it hasn't been released already.
Mary and Chris asked very similar questions, and they want to know your thoughts about planting tomatoes in the same area year after year.
If you do that, you will see probably kind of a sloped line downward in terms of plant health and productivity. So, however, that big garden I showed you that I dug out in Raleigh, I had tomatoes in there for 12 years. And I would say the last couple of years, they weren't doing their best, but it was also, I was starting to lose sun exposure. So the true answer to that question is if they continue to do well, if your soil is healthy, if you put good stuff back into it, if you treat the plants well, they should do fine. The when you really need to rotate is if somehow fusarium wilt pops up in there, or you find that tomato spotted wilt is starting to appear everywhere. It means that somewhere near that garden, you have thrips have taken a stronghold and they're chewing on your tomato flowers, or all of a sudden late blight is a problem every year. So make that decision based on performance. And if things start to look like they're dropping off, then it's time to start thinking about moving them around a little bit.
John says, I find that my heirlooms and open pollinated seem to have a shorter shelf life.
Mm.
Is that normal?
It's not only normal, it's why they're so delicious. So a lot of the hybrids have been bred. Initially, they were bred for shelf life. Um, that was the biggie. So that, when you go to the grocery store and you see them stacked in a pyramid 10 tall, the ones at the bottom won't rot even after 3 weeks or a month, or they can pick the hybrids and put them in a railroad car green and gas them with ethylene, which will force them to ripen, and then you get your tasteless burger tomato at a fast food joint. Heirlooms are what they are. They're a unique packet of genes. Once they ripen, the clock starts, and there is variation variety to variety on shelf life. And I will say one more vote for picking at breaker stage. The shelf life of an heirloom that slowly ripens on your shelf is much, much, much longer than one that you pick fully ripe and bring in the house. So you can get a week out of a variety that's picked breaker stage and it ripens indoors versus 2 or 3 days or less versus one that you pick off the vine that's fully ripe. So that's one to give a try to. But it just goes with the territory that and that's where you get fancy about canning and roasting sauce and doing other things like that.
Okay, final question, Craig. T Young says that you mentioned a seed company in Greece
Mm.
and asks, is that Meraki,
Yeah,
Meraki?
yeah, they become good friends of mine, and in fact, I owe them a whole bunch of new dwarfs I want to send them so they can get them in their catalog. But really, really nice people. You know, gardeners everywhere are really, really nice people. But yes, that's the company in Greece.
Okay.
Wow.
We have some more questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them. If you want to contact Craig directly, Craig, again, can you give your email address? Just
Yes.
one.
NC Tomatoman, all one word. Let me go back here. Whoop, it's frozen. NCTOMATOMAN @gmail.com.
Okay. And if anyone wants to follow up with Craig, that's the email address. Craig, first of all, on behalf of everybody at Master Gardeners of Greater Kansas City, I just really want to thank you. You've gone above and beyond. You and I have been talking for a few months now about this program, and we had a great turnout. Thank you so much.
It was my pleasure. It was a lot of fun. It's the first event of the year that's like this. I'll never forget it. So thank you all for coming. Thank you for hosting me, and have a great garden and let me know how it goes, folks. Bring me along on the ride.
Thank you, Craig.
Have a good night, everyone. Are you going to keep recording or are you going to?